Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Sicilian Christmas pizza. That's right, if you're making a list and checking it twice, I really hope that somewhere on that list it says make Sfincione, which is an incredibly unique and delicious anchovy and onion pizza that's served during the holidays and other special occasions in Sicily. And by the way, we're not necessarily telling our guests that this is an onion and anchovy pizza, since that may turn off a few folks, which would be a terrible shame. Since everybody, and I do mean everybody, needs to taste this pizza. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the dough, which is going to start with a couple cups of very warm water. It's in about 105 degrees. And what we'll do is sprinkle a package of yeast over the top, and we'll let that bloom for exactly as long as it takes us to go grab the rest of the ingredients, which will include a touch of salt and some white sugar, or a little honey, as well as a nice drizzle of olive oil, preferably Sicilian. And then last but not least, of course, we're going to need some flour. Oh, and do me a favor. Ignore the water I somehow splashed on the lens. I eventually wiped it off. But anyway, what we'll do is grab our dough hook and knead this on our stand mixer for about 6 or 7 minutes, occasionally scraping down the sides if necessary. And we'll keep kneading that until it forms a very smooth, very elastic, extremely wet and soft dough. In fact, this stuff is so much wetter than regular pizza doughs that if you didn't see the video and were just going by a written recipe, you would think there was some kind of mistake. But there's not. Okay, to achieve the gorgeous, light, spongy texture we want with the crust, we really do want our dough this wet and sticky. And at this point, it may seem like it's way too runny and loose to work with, which, by the way, it is. But that's okay because we're not going to work with it yet. All we're going to do at this point is cover it and let it sit in a warm spot for about an hour and a half, or until it doubles in size. And while we're waiting for that, we'll go ahead and move on to make our anchovy onion sauce. Oops, sorry, I meant Sicilian Christmas pizza sauce. And what we'll do to start that is saute a couple onions and a little bit of olive oil over medium heat, along with a nice big pinch of salt. And we'll cook those stirring occasionally until they soften and sweeten up. And we really do need a good amount here. All right, you want to use at least 2 onions. And if they're small, use 3. And that's because the sweetness of these onions really helps balance out the intensity of the other ingredients. So like I said, we'll go ahead and cook those stirring on medium for about 6 or 7 minutes until they soften and sweeten and turn translucent, at which point we go ahead and add the rest of the ingredients, which will include a whole bunch of red chili flakes, as well as some freshly ground black pepper. And we'll also add a nice squirt of tomato paste, as well as a fairly giant pinch of dry oregano. And then the co-star of this sauce along with the onions, 9 oil-packed anchovy fillet. Okay, 8 is not enough, and 10 is too many. Oh, and by the way, do not throw the olive oil away those came packed in. We're going to use that as a secret ingredient later. And what we'll do is cook this stirring for a few minutes until basically those anchovies dissolve and we can't see them anymore. At which point we'll stop and add the last ingredient, some kind of prepared tomato sauce. All right, anything fairly neutral is going to work, and I'm just using a good old-fashioned marinara sauce. And like all good Italians, we'll also use a splash of water to rinse out our jar or container. And once all that's been stirred together, all we have to do to finish the sauce off is let this simmer on medium-low for about 20 minutes or so, at which point, other than tasting it for seasoning, it's going to be ready to use. And one thing most of the ingredients we just added have in common, they are very high in glutamates, which, by the way, is what the G in MSG stands for. And foods that are rich in glutamates, like onions and anchovies and tomato paste and cheese, not only do those foods taste good themselves, but they also make other foods taste better. And this umami bomb of a sauce we're making really is the secret to the extreme savoriness of this pizza. But anyway, like I said, we'll let that simmer on medium-low for about 20 minutes, at which point we can turn it off and simply set it aside until needed. While we move on to the other component that makes this pizza so unique and delicious, our crispy breadcrumb topping. And to make that, we're going to combine some fine, dry, plain breadcrumbs with a whole bunch of freshly and finely grated pecorino cheese. And what we'll do is take a fork and give that a quick mix before we add in our olive oil. And not one, but 2 kinds. Okay, first we're going to add the olive oil that came packed with our anchovies. And hopefully we'll have at least about a tablespoon of that. And then we'll also to that add another tablespoon or 2 of regular olive oil. And then we'll take our fork and give this another mix. And we'll keep mixing until we're confident all those breadcrumbs have been moistened with the oil. And by sneaking in a little bit of that anchovy oil, we are significantly increasing how flavorful these crumbs are going to be. Because glutamates, as we just covered. So we'll go ahead and give that a stir and set those aside. And then assuming our dough is risen, we can move into final production. which means we're going to have to very generously olive oil a sheet pan. Like very generously. Okay, that's probably like 3 tablespoons. And then once our pan is greased, we'll go ahead and transfer on our dough, which hopefully after about an hour and a half is doubled and looks a little something like this. And then using a very, very well-oiled hand, we will attempt to transfer that onto the pan, which is going to take a few seconds, since this stuff is extremely elastic and it's going to want to stay in the bowl. But anyway, eventually, somehow, some way, we will transfer that on. And then dipping our fingers and hands liberally in that olive oil, we'll attempt to spread this dough out all the way to the edges. And we're doing that with a combination of pulling, stretching, and pressing. And because this dough is so soft and elastic, you're probably not going to be able to do that in one shot. All right, because as you stretch this into the corners, it's going to want to pull back, which is totally normal and nothing to be alarmed about. But what we may have to do a couple times is just let the dough rest. Okay, stretch it out as far as you can and just stop. And just look out the window thinking happy thoughts for a couple minutes. At which point we can return, oil our fingers again, and continue stretching. And you may actually have to do that let it rest trick like 2 or 3 times. But eventually the dough will resign itself to its fate, and your pan will be covered all the way to the corners. At which point we can proceed to spoon on and spread over the sauce. And generally we want to spoon it over and distribute it first, and then spread it out. Especially when it's kind of thick and chunky like this. And if you want, you can go all the way to the edges. But I'm going to try to stop about a ½ inch from the pan, mostly for appearance's sake. And then once our sauce is down, we can go ahead and sprinkle over whatever grated cheese we're using. Okay, I'm using a combination of mozzarella and aged provolone, and I will review those choices in more detail in the blog post. And as you'll probably notice, I'm not going to put on a ton of cheese. Okay, legend has it that the breadcrumb mixture we're going to top this with was originally intended to stretch the amount of cheese, which of course was way more expensive and harder to get than breadcrumbs. So in keeping with that tradition, I will fight all my American impulses and not put on too much. But of course, having said that, you put on as much as you want. I mean, you are after all the Chuck Mangione of your Sfincione. But I think to really appreciate this for what it is, you don't want to add too much cheese. Okay, I only put on like 5 or 6 ounces total. And then what we'll do once our grated cheese is on is go ahead and top the surface with our breadcrumb mixture. And we will try to sprinkle that on as even as possible. But do not under any circumstances press that down. Okay, we do not want to compact and compress things. Nor do we want to deflate our dough, which has been quietly rising as we've added on these other components. So we will very thoughtfully and gently add our breadcrumbs to the top. At which point we'll finish this off with a drizzle of olive oil. And that's it, our Sicilian Christmas pizza is now ready to place into the center of a 400-degree oven for about 35 minutes or so, or until the bottom of our crust is cooked, and everything is beautifully browned and looking so gorgeous as to almost take your breath away. I mean, come on, look at that color and texture. I think that's just absolutely stunning. And then if you can, once this comes out, I generally like to transfer it to a cooling rack so that our beautiful golden bottom crust doesn't absorb a bunch of moisture as it sits. But you know what? I was running out of daylight. So I transferred this straight to my cutting board, and I grabbed my pizza wheel and started cutting this up. And I was actually going to cut this all up first before trying, but the smell of this thing was just so intoxicating and alluring that I was forced to stop and grab a piece and dig right in. And that, my friends, is one of the most interesting and delicious things you'll ever taste, pizza or otherwise. All right, thanks to that super soft dough, we have a sort of spongy, tender, feather-like crust. This should, if we cooked it long enough, have a nice golden brown bottom. And the combination of that very light, slightly chewy crust with that super savory sauce, with those crispy, cheesy breadcrumbs on top, it is just so unique and unusual and addictive. It's virtually impossible to describe. All right, one problem with pizzas that have a thicker crust like this is that you don't get that crunch. Well, here we don't have to worry about that. All right, so with that very unique topping, we have a pizza that's just as fascinating as it is effective. So I just cannot stress enough how absolutely amazing this stuff is. But that was the cutting board piece. I must, of course, serve another one up so I can get some plated shots. In this one, I'll give the traditional garnish of a little bit more dry oregano. And while that first piece was absolutely incredible, the second piece is even better, because this is one of those pizzas that gets more delicious as it cools down. Okay, it's very good warm, it's great room temperature, and it's absolutely unbelievable cold. All right, thanks to that crumbly, crunchy top, this is sort of like a savory pizza coffee cake. Or at least that's how my wife Michelle described it. And I have to agree. And because it is so amazing at all those different temperatures, this is the perfect party pizza. But anyway, that's it. My take on Sfincione. On behalf of myself and this future Chef John action figure, seen here balancing some baked goods on his forearm. On behalf of both of us, we'd like to wish you happy holidays, and we really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.